I'm Barbara Crump, and I work at the Meier Clinics in Richardson, and I'm an LPC LMFT. The Meier Clinic is a Christian faith-based mental health services provider, and we have psychologists, psychiatrists, nurse practitioners, and the goal of the Meier Clinic over 40 years ago was to make sure that the community has access to mental health services at a low cost. First responder minds are different because they're going to be more wired to be hypervigilant, scanning, paying attention for things like danger and what is going on in their environment. But I also think the first responder mind is special because they tend to be people who are quick to help, compassionate, and those are the kind of things that we want to emphasize when we're working with first responders. Being culturally competent when working with first responders is really important because if you're taking the time and money to go in and see a counselor because it's time, well, you want to be spending your time working through the things that you came in for and not necessarily explaining the lifestyle to the counselor or provider. So it's very helpful when they kind of know the lingo, they know in general how things are, what your life and lifestyle is like, what the stress is like, what the traumatic experiences may be like, because then you can really spend your time unpacking those things and not necessarily familiarizing them with the lifestyle. Some of the common issues I see when working with the first responder community are things like taking care of other people first. So one of the things that we really work on is making sure that the first responders are taking care of themselves too. So that can be simple things like making sure sleep, nutrition, activity, friends. Then we're going to start unpacking things like calls. Maybe there's been some traumatic critical incidences. Maybe, or perhaps, what I see a lot is people who go into the profession because they wanted to help people because maybe they came from some challenging places in the past. So maybe we even have to dig a little bit deeper into the past to make sure all of we're working with all of it at the same time. With first responders, we do things like CBT, so that's cognitive behavior therapy. Really what that can sound like in the counseling room is just reframing things. So sometimes talking things out, we start to notice that there are some ways that we think about things that could be corrected. So for example, saying, my spouse always yells at me. Well, does my spouse always yell at me, or does my spouse yell at me sometimes, and other times they're good listeners? So what we call that is just reframing with cognitive behavior. Another form that we work on is making sure that there's a trauma modality. So I personally use EMDR and ART, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then of course there's always just psychoeducation of understanding the stress response for the first responder. So EMDR and ART are two very similar trauma modalities. So EMDR was started in the 90s by Francine Shapiro, and it stands for Eye Movement Desensitization Reprocessing. So in general, what we got from that modality is that when the eyes are moving back and forth, it creates a bilateral stimulation, which allows the brain to reprocess traumatic events. Now, ART is accelerated resolution therapy. So it's a very similar modality, except the protocol, the questions that I ask while we're following the dots or the eyes are going back and forth are a little bit different. So it's going to help the person who's experienced the traumatic call to reprocess it or to store the memory in a better place in their brain. And with ART, we say, keep the knowledge, lose the pain. So what that means is the memory is still there, but that cringe, full body, I can't sleep, I'm reliving it all the time, is gone. Things to pay attention to for the first responder are things like sleep, So sleep is a challenge for so many, but making sure your sleep is where it needs to be, whether that's a sleep study or perhaps using some sleep tools. Nutrition is very important, activity is very important. My favorite happens to be people or friendships, family and fun. So making sure that the first responder also has those aspects in their life too. Our brain needs those aspects just as much as it does everything else.